There is a moment that almost every person encounters at some point in their life, a moment where they are standing in the middle of a difficult situation, a conflict at work, a crisis at home, a team falling apart, a plan unraveling, and they realize that what happens next depends entirely on them, not on their title, not on their salary, not on how long they have been with the organization or how many people technically report to them. What happens next depends on how they think, on how they respond, on whether they are capable, in that exact moment, of being the person the situation requires them to be. Most people, when they imagine leadership, picture something external. They picture a position of authority, a corner office, a confident stride into a boardroom. They picture someone who commands attention simply by entering a room, someone who speaks and makes others listen, someone who holds power and wields it when necessary. And there is nothing entirely wrong with that image. But it is incomplete. It is, in fact, dangerously incomplete, because it places leadership outside of the person and attaches it to circumstances, titles, and the approval of others. The truth about leadership is quieter than that image suggests. It is more personal, more internal, and far more demanding. Leadership in its truest form is a way of thinking before it is ever a way of acting. It is a cognitive and emotional orientation toward the world, a particular way of processing difficulty, handling uncertainty, taking responsibility, and staying clear when clarity feels impossible. Every action that a genuine leader takes flows from something happening inside them first. The calm response to a crisis does not begin in the moment of crisis. It begins in the weeks, months, and years of internal discipline that came before it. The wise decision made under pressure is not an accident. It is the product of a mind that has been deliberately trained to think beyond the immediate, to weigh consequences, to resist the pull of short-term comfort. Most people never become genuine leaders, not because they lack intelligence, not because they lack ambition, but because they never develop the internal architecture that leadership requires. They remain, throughout their lives, primarily reactive. They respond to the world based on how the world makes them feel in a given moment. When things go well, they feel capable and generous. When things go badly, they feel threatened and defensive. Their behavior is governed by their emotional state, and their emotional state is governed entirely by external events. This is the condition of most human beings, not because they are weak or flawed, but simply because nobody taught them anything different. And this is worth sitting with for a moment, because if you look at the trajectory of most lives, even lives that appear, from the outside, to be successful, you can trace this pattern clearly. The person who has worked in an organization for 15 years and is genuinely respected for their technical skills, but who, the moment conflict arises, shuts down or lashes out. The entrepreneur who builds a real business but cannot hold a team together because their communication shifts dramatically depending on whether they are under pressure or not. The parent who genuinely loves their children, but whose emotional volatility teaches those children to manage around them rather than rely on them. The friend who is wonderful in easy times and unreachable in hard ones. None of these people lack intelligence or good intentions. What they lack is the specific, cultivated interior capacity that genuine leadership requires. The capacity to feel the full force of difficult emotions and still choose a response that reflects their best judgment rather than their worst mood. The capacity to stay anchored to their values when external conditions are pulling hard in every other direction. And here is the deeper pattern worth noticing. Most people know, on some level, that they are operating below their leadership potential. They can feel the gap between who they are under pressure and who they want to be. They can sense when their reactive behavior is costing them in trust, in respect, in the quality of the relationships they are trying to build. But they have not been given a clear understanding of what would actually close that gap. So they try harder in the obvious ways. They read books about communication. They attend leadership development workshops. They try to remember to be more patient, or more decisive, or more empathetic. And then the pressure rises, and the old patterns reassert themselves, and the gap remains. This happens because the obvious interventions, the communication frameworks, the behavioral techniques, are being applied on top of an internal structure that has not changed. They are surface-level solutions to a deeper problem. The deeper problem is that the person has not yet built the internal foundation, the genuine emotional regulation, the clarity of values, the discipline of consistent behavior, from which authentic leadership behavior naturally flows. Without that foundation, any technique is temporary. It holds until the pressure becomes significant enough, and then it gives way, because it was never truly integrated into who the person is. This audiobook is an invitation to work at that deeper level, to look honestly at the foundation, at the beliefs, the emotional patterns, the behavioral tendencies that currently shape how you show up as a leader or as someone with the potential to lead, and to begin, with patience and without judgment, to build something more solid, something that will hold when the pressure is real. The mindset of leadership is not something you are born with. It is something you build, deliberately, patiently, one decision at a time, one disciplined response at a time, one moment of choosing clarity over reaction at a time. It is available to anyone willing to do the interior work that most people quietly avoid. This audiobook is about that interior work. It is not about tactics or strategies in the conventional sense. It is not a list of habits or a framework for productivity. It is something more foundational than any of that. It is an exploration of the psychological terrain of genuine leadership. The mindset, the emotional architecture, the values and disciplines that distinguish a true leader from someone who simply holds a leadership title. What you will find here is an honest examination of what leadership actually asks of a person. It asks for ownership. It asks for emotional control. It asks for the ability to hold a long-term vision when short-term pressures are screaming for your attention. It asks for the courage to make decisions in the presence of uncertainty and the discipline to maintain standards even when no one is watching. It also asks you to be honest with yourself about the ways you currently fall short of that. Because every person who becomes a true leader begins as someone who was not one. The transformation does not happen all at once. It happens in small, consistent choices made over time. And it always begins with awareness, with the willingness to look clearly at yourself and ask whether the way you are currently thinking, responding, and moving through the world is genuinely worthy of the kind of influence you want to have. So let us begin there. Let us begin with the truth that most people find uncomfortable, but that every real leader has learned to sit with calmly. The truth is this: everything changes when you take full responsibility for your life, your decisions, and the environment you create around you. Not partial responsibility, not responsibility with footnotes and exceptions. Full, unconditional, non-negotiable ownership of where you are and where you are going. That is where leadership starts. There is a behavior that is so common, so deeply embedded in ordinary human psychology, that most people do not even recognize they are doing it. It is the behavior of assigning cause. When something goes wrong, the human mind moves immediately and instinctively toward identifying a reason, and more specifically, toward identifying someone or something outside of itself as that reason. The project failed because of the team's lack of effort. The relationship deteriorated because of the other person's behavior. The opportunity was missed because of the economy, the timing, the circumstances. The promotion was denied because of office politics, bias, or someone else's favoritism. Now, some of these explanations may contain genuine truth. Teams do sometimes underperform. Relationships are shaped by both parties. External circumstances do affect outcomes. There is no wisdom in denying reality. But here is where the distinction between a reactive person and a leader becomes visible. A reactive person uses external explanation as a destination. They arrive at, someone else caused this, and they stop there, feeling temporarily relieved of the weight of the situation. A leader uses external analysis as a starting point. They acknowledge what was outside their control, and then they immediately turn their attention back to what was inside their control and ask themselves honestly what more they could have done, seen earlier, decided differently, or communicated more clearly. This is not a philosophical position. It is a practical one. It is about power. When you locate the cause of your problems primarily outside yourself, you simultaneously locate the solution outside yourself. You place your ability to move forward in the hands of other people, external conditions, and circumstances that you cannot change. You make yourself, functionally, powerless. Not because someone has taken power from you, but because you have unconsciously given it away. When you locate responsibility within yourself, even partial responsibility, even the responsibility of how you responded to something you did not cause, you reclaim the ability to act. You restore your own agency. You become someone who can do something about where they are, rather than someone who simply has opinions about why they are there. True leaders understand this with a depth that goes beyond intellectual agreement. They live it. And it is genuinely difficult, because taking full ownership, especially of outcomes that genuinely had contributing factors outside your control, is emotionally uncomfortable. It requires a kind of ego, strength that most people do not develop naturally. It requires you to be able to hold discomfort without needing to redirect it outward. It requires you to say, clearly and without self-pity, I am responsible for this, not as self-punishment, not as a performance of humility for others to witness, but as a quiet, private, functional truth that you hold about your own power and your own role in the situations you find yourself in. Consider what this looks like in practice. A leader is running a project. The project hits serious trouble halfway through. Deadlines are missed. A key team member delivers work that is far below the required standard. Stakeholders are frustrated. In this moment, the reactive response, the very human response, is to immediately assess blame. The team member did not deliver. The original scope was too ambitious. The timeline set by management was unrealistic. The tools provided were insufficient. All of this analysis may be accurate, but a leader does not begin there. A leader begins with themselves. What did I miss in the early stages of this project? Did I check in often enough to catch the problem before it became critical? Did I communicate the standards clearly from the start? Did I give the team member everything they needed, or did I assume that everything was on track because no one came to me with a problem? Was I managing this project, or was I hoping this project was managing itself? These are uncomfortable questions. They require an honesty that ego resists. But they are also the questions that produce growth, correction, and improvement. They are the questions that, over time, make someone genuinely better at what they do. The person who never asks these questions may never feel responsible for failure. But they also never develop the kind of capability that prevents failure in the future. This kind of self-examination requires a particular emotional posture. It is not self-flagellation. A leader who turns inward after every setback and uses it as an opportunity to reinforce a narrative of personal inadequacy is not practicing ownership. They are practicing a different kind of avoidance. The self-criticism becomes its own form of emotional indulgence, one that feels virtuous but actually prevents the clear-eyed functional analysis that genuine improvement requires. Ownership means asking hard questions from a place of stability and genuine curiosity, not from a place of anxiety or shame. It means engaging with the question, what could I have done differently? As if it were a genuinely interesting question with a practically useful answer, rather than a form of psychological punishment. There is something else worth understanding about ownership, and it is subtler than the question of blame. Ownership is not just about what went wrong. It is about the environment you create around you, the culture of your team, the quality of your relationships, the standards that govern how things are done in your world. A true leader understands that everything in their sphere of influence is, to some degree, a reflection of their leadership, not as an ego statement, but as a functional reality. The way your team communicates, that is shaped by how you communicate. The level of accountability on your team, that is shaped by the accountability you model. The emotional tone of a group, that is set, more than anything else, by the emotional tone of the person in the leadership role. This is a weight that many people are not prepared to carry. It is significant. It means that leadership is not a role you can put on and take off like a jacket. It is something you live consistently across contexts and conditions. Because people are always watching, not always consciously, but they are absorbing. They are measuring whether the person in front of them is consistent, whether what that person says aligns with what they do, whether the standards they hold for others are standards they hold for themselves, and they adjust their own behavior accordingly. This is one of the most important dynamics in all of organizational and relational psychology. People do not follow what leaders say nearly as consistently as they follow what leaders do. A leader who preaches punctuality and arrives late is not actually modeling punctuality. They are modeling the gap between words and behavior. A leader who emphasizes team trust but speaks critically about absent colleagues is not building trust. They are quietly eroding it. Leadership requires that the internal and external be aligned, that what you believe, what you say, and what you do are the same thing, or close enough to the same thing that the gap is genuinely small and genuinely acknowledged when it exists. And this alignment, this congruence between stated values and lived behavior, is not just about the big moments. It is not just about the dramatic decisions or the high visibility situations where your integrity is obviously being tested. It is, even more significantly, about the accumulation of small moments. The email you reply to with genuine care, even though you are exhausted. The meeting you show up to fully present, even though 3 other priorities are competing for your mental bandwidth. The conversation you have with a team member about a small piece of underperformance, even though it would have been easier to let it pass. These small moments are where character is actually formed and where trust is actually built, because character is not something you demonstrate once, spectacularly, under pressure. It is something you demonstrate in the ordinary weave of everyday behavior, accumulated over time into something that is identifiable and reliable. Ownership extends even to the edges of your influence. It extends to the things you walk past without addressing, the problems you see but choose to ignore because addressing them feels difficult or politically uncomfortable. Every time a leader walks past a standard being violated without addressing it, they are communicating something, not with words, but with silence and with behavior. They are communicating that the standard is negotiable, that it does not actually matter as much as they said it did. And once a standard is understood to be negotiable, it begins to erode. And once standards erode, the culture they were holding up erodes with them. So ownership is not passive. It is not merely a posture of self-accountability. It is active. It means creating the environment you want to see through consistent behavior, consistent communication, and consistent willingness to engage with difficulty directly rather than deflect or avoid. A true leader does not wait for the environment to improve before they step into ownership. They understand that the improvement of the environment is inseparable from the quality of their own presence within it. This is the foundation of genuine leadership. Before you develop strategy, before you learn to communicate brilliantly, before you cultivate vision or build a culture, you must first become someone who owns their reality, who looks at their world honestly, acknowledges their role in shaping it, and moves forward from that honest place, rather than from the comforting fiction that everything is someone else's responsibility. There is a particular freedom that comes with full ownership, a freedom that is not immediately obvious and that many people discover only after living through the alternative long enough to compare. The freedom is this: when you own your outcomes, you are no longer a passive recipient of whatever life and circumstances deliver to you. You become an active participant in the shaping of your own experience. This is not the naive claim that you can control everything, or that circumstances do not matter, or that systemic inequities and external obstacles are irrelevant. They are real, and they matter. But even within genuine constraint, there is almost always more agency available than a reactive mindset will perceive. The reactive mindset is so focused on what it cannot change that it consistently underestimates what it can. The ownership mindset is focused on what it can influence, and so it finds leverage that the reactive mindset never sees. There is also a way in which full ownership changes your relationship with other people. When you stop needing others to be responsible for your discomfort, when you stop requiring circumstances to be different before you can feel capable or steady, something shifts in how you move through the world. You become less demanding of others in the specific, corrosive way that defensiveness and blame create demands. You become more genuinely curious about other people's experience, because you are no longer using their behavior primarily as data about your own situation. You become more capable of generosity because you are not depleted by the ongoing project of assigning fault. None of this is easy, and none of it is achieved once and sustained effortlessly thereafter. It is a practice, specifically a practice of returning, again and again, to the question, what is my role in this? What can I do? What could I have done differently? Not as self-punishment, but as the honest, functional inquiry of someone who understands that their agency is real and that exercising it is both a responsibility and a privilege. It is not an easy foundation to build, but it is the only one that holds. When people speak about emotional intelligence, they sometimes describe it as a kind of social skill, the ability to read a room, to sense what others are feeling, to connect with people on an emotional level. That dimension is real and it is valuable. But there is a more fundamental aspect of emotional intelligence that rarely receives the attention it deserves. And it is this: the ability to regulate your own emotional state in real time, particularly under conditions of pressure, uncertainty, or conflict. This is not about suppressing emotion. That is a critical distinction, and it is worth making clearly. Suppression and regulation are not the same thing. A person who suppresses emotion pushes it down beneath the surface, where it does not disappear, but instead accumulates, distorts thinking in invisible ways, and eventually surfaces in behavior that can be disproportionate, misdirected, or deeply damaging. Suppression creates a kind of emotional debt. You keep deferring the cost, but the cost keeps growing, and at some point it will be collected. Often at the worst possible moment, in the worst possible way. Regulation is different. Regulation means that you feel the emotion fully. You do not deny it. You do not pretend it is not there. But you do not allow it to govern your response. You create, through practice and discipline, a space between stimulus and response. In that space you choose. You choose how to interpret what has just happened. You choose what it means about you and about the situation. And you choose how to respond in a way that is aligned with your values and your goals, rather than aligned with your momentary emotional state. That space is extraordinarily powerful. It is, in many ways, the most important psychological real estate a leader can develop. Because most of the damage done in organizations, in relationships, and in personal lives does not come from catastrophic decisions made after long deliberation. It comes from reactive responses made in seconds, from the sharp reply sent in frustration, the public criticism made in a moment of irritation, the decision made from a place of fear that looks, superficially, like decisiveness. These small reactive moments accumulate into patterns, and patterns become reputations, and reputations become the fundamental reality of how others experience you as a leader. So the question is not whether you will face situations that generate difficult emotions. You will. Leadership, by its nature, involves navigating conflict, disappointment, criticism, uncertainty, and the constant friction of human beings who are all, simultaneously, carrying their own pressures, fears, and agendas. The question is whether you will be governed by the emotions those situations produce, or whether you will govern them. Consider what happens to thinking under the influence of strong negative emotion. When fear is dominant, the mind narrows. Its focus contracts onto the perceived threat and away from the broader context, the longer timeline, the full complexity of the situation. The range of options that the mind perceives as available shrinks dramatically. This is, evolutionarily, a useful feature. In situations of physical threat, narrow focus on the danger in front of you is adaptive, but in the complex, multi-variable environments that modern leadership navigates, it is catastrophic. A leader who is operating from fear, even fear they are not conscious of, makes smaller decisions, sees fewer options, and consistently chooses the path that reduces immediate discomfort rather than the path that serves long-term goals. Anger, similarly, distorts. An angry mind is a mind convinced of its own rightness. It stops listening. It stops considering alternative perspectives. It interprets neutral information through a lens of hostility and sees confirmation of its grievances everywhere. An angry leader is, functionally, a partially blind leader, because they can only see the parts of the situation that align with what they are already feeling. What makes this particularly insidious is that anger tends to be self-reinforcing. The more angry you become, the more you perceive reasons to be angry, because your filtering system has been recalibrated to look for threat and grievance, and so anger compounds anger until the original trigger, which may have been relatively minor, has generated a response that is dramatically disproportionate and has left real damage in its wake. Anxiety creates a particular kind of cognitive static. The anxious mind rehearses negative outcomes with remarkable creativity and thoroughness, but it spends very little time analyzing those outcomes realistically or generating effective responses to them. It is busy with worry, and worry, despite feeling like thinking, is not the same as thinking. Worry is emotional processing dressed in cognitive clothing. It is the mind generating the feeling of doing something without actually doing anything productive. Leaders who are chronically anxious tend to communicate that anxiety to everyone around them through their questions, their oversight patterns, their level of need for reassurance and status updates. And anxiety, like all emotional states, is contagious. A team led by an anxious leader becomes an anxious team, and an anxious team stops taking the kinds of productive risks that are necessary for genuine progress. Calm is the antidote to all of these, not forced calm, not the brittle, performative calm of someone trying very hard not to appear upset. Genuine calm, the kind that comes from a regulated nervous system, a clear sense of values, and a practiced ability to orient oneself in difficulty without losing perspective. A calm leader in a crisis is not a leader who does not feel the weight of the situation. They feel it. They understand what is at stake. But they have developed the ability to hold that weight without being bent by it, to let the seriousness of the situation inform their focus without allowing it to destabilize their thinking. This is enormously valuable to everyone around them, because in any difficult situation, the emotional state of the leader is contagious. When the leader is anxious, the team is anxious. When the leader is reactive, the team becomes reactive. But when the leader is calm, genuinely, grounded, functionally calm, that calm radiates outward. It gives other people permission to think, to breathe, to access their own judgment, rather than dissolving into collective panic. This is one of the least discussed but most important functions of leadership, the management of the emotional field. The leader, by virtue of their role and the attention that role commands, sets the emotional tone. And the emotional tone determines, more than any strategy or plan, what is actually possible in a given situation. A team in a calm, clear emotional state can work through genuinely complex problems with creativity and efficiency. That same team, in a state of anxiety or reactive tension, will spend most of its cognitive resources managing the emotional environment rather than addressing the actual problem. How does one build this kind of emotional regulation? Not through willpower alone. Willpower is a finite resource. It can be depleted by stress, by fatigue, by accumulated frustration. A leader who is relying purely on willpower to maintain emotional control is, in a sense, one bad day away from losing it. What builds genuine emotional regulation is something deeper: the development of values that are clearer than emotions, an understanding of who you are and what you stand for that remains stable, even when emotions are turbulent. When you know clearly what you value: honesty, contribution, respect, long-term thinking, quality, those values become an anchor. When emotion rises and pulls you toward a reactive response, your values provide something to hold on to. They give you a reason to pause, to breathe, to choose a response that is aligned with who you are trying to be rather than simply with how you are feeling in the moment. This is why self-knowledge is foundational to emotional regulation. Not self-knowledge in the abstract, philosophical sense of knowing your personality type or understanding your childhood. Self-knowledge in the operational sense, knowing specifically what situations tend to trigger strong emotional responses in you. Knowing what stories you tend to tell yourself when you are under pressure. Knowing which particular flavor of discomfort is most likely to pull you off center. This kind of self-knowledge gives you advance notice. It means that when you walk into a meeting that you know tends to generate conflict, you can prepare yourself. You can enter with your awareness heightened, with your values consciously held, with your intention clearly set. You are not simply responding to the situation as it unfolds. You are, in a meaningful sense, choosing in advance how you will navigate it. There is also a physical dimension to this that is worth acknowledging. Emotional regulation is not only a psychological skill, it is partly physiological. The nervous system that generates the emotional response can, to a significant degree, be trained. The practice of breathing deliberately in high-pressure moments, not as a mystical technique, but as a simple, functional intervention in the body's stress response, genuinely changes what is available to you cognitively in those moments. The practice of physical discipline in general, sleep, movement, nutrition, affects the baseline of the nervous system in ways that directly influence emotional regulation capacity. These are not peripheral concerns for leaders. They are foundational ones. A leader who consistently runs their nervous system at the edge of depletion through chronic overwork and poor self-care is making their own emotional regulation significantly harder than it needs to be. And they are doing so at the cost of the people who depend on their steady, clear-minded presence. Leaders who have developed strong emotional regulation over time often describe it not as effortful control, but as a kind of settled confidence. They are not fighting their emotions. They are not white-knuckling their way through difficult conversations. They have simply, through years of practice, developed the capacity to be present in difficult situations without being controlled by them. This capacity is among the most powerful things any person in a position of influence can cultivate, and it is available, with genuine effort and genuine honesty, to anyone. The organizational implications of this, of a leader who has built genuine emotional regulation, are worth stating clearly. Such a leader creates a fundamentally different organizational experience than a leader who has not. The emotional climate of an organization does not self-generate. It is shaped, continuously and significantly, by the emotional quality of its leaders. A leader who is regulated creates an organization where people feel, fundamentally, safe enough to do good work, where the energy that might otherwise go toward managing interpersonal risk and reading the emotional weather of the room goes instead toward the actual mission, where the team's collective intelligence is available for the problems the organization faces rather than partially consumed by the problem of navigating around a leader's emotional volatility. This is not an idealistic vision, it is a practical one. Organizations that are emotionally healthy, where people feel genuinely safe, genuinely respected, and genuinely able to speak freely, consistently outperform those that are not. Not because they are nice places to work, though they often are, but because psychological safety, created by emotionally regulated leadership, releases the full cognitive capacity of every person in the organization, and that released capacity is a performance advantage that no technical strategy or structural intervention can replicate. There is a person, call him Marcus, who had every external indicator of leadership potential. He was intelligent. He was hardworking. He had strong opinions and was not afraid to share them. He moved up quickly in his organization, earning responsibility early and accumulating a reputation as someone who got things done. By his mid-30s, he was leading a significant team, managing a complex portfolio of projects, and being quietly identified as a future senior leader. But something wasn't working, and the people around Marcus felt it, even when they could not articulate it precisely. The issue was this: Marcus operated almost entirely on the basis of his immediate emotional state, not in obvious ways, not in ways that made him seem unstable or unprofessional to a casual observer, in subtle, persistent ways that slowly corroded the environment around him without anyone being able to point to a single dramatic incident as the cause. When Marcus was energized and optimistic, which happened regularly, he was genuinely inspiring. He would walk into the morning stand, up full of ideas, enthusiastic about the week ahead, generous with his attention and his encouragement. The team loved those days. There was momentum. There was a feeling of possibility. Projects moved quickly and people felt genuinely engaged. But when Marcus was stressed, and stress was not uncommon in his role, something shifted. He became sharper in his communication, quicker to find fault, more likely to see problems than progress. Small errors that he would have laughed off in a better mood became evidence of systemic failure. A delayed report, on a good day, was a minor administrative issue. On a difficult day, it became a symptom of the team's lack of professionalism, and Marcus would raise it in a way that left the relevant person feeling publicly exposed and personally criticized rather than simply accountable. He did not intend this. He was not deliberately trying to humiliate anyone. He was simply allowing the amplifier of his stress to color everything he looked at, and the people around him absorbed it every time. There was also the question of consistency, because Marcus's mood varied, and because his mood affected his behavior so significantly. His team had become skilled, with that quiet intelligence that people develop around unpredictable leaders, at reading the room before every interaction with him. They had learned to calibrate their communication based on where Marcus seemed to be that day. On good days, they brought him problems. On difficult days, they kept things to themselves, smoothed over issues, delayed hard conversations, not because the problems had gone away, but because they had learned that raising them when Marcus was stressed created more difficulty than it resolved. This dynamic, The team strategically managing information based on the perceived emotional state of the leader is one of the most damaging things that can develop in an organization. It means that the person in the leadership role is no longer receiving accurate information about reality. They are receiving a filtered, managed version of reality designed to minimize friction. And they may not even know it is happening, because no one is going to tell them directly. The team has adapted to the environment. The environment has adapted to the leader, but the adaptation has made the organization functionally less capable, less honest, and less able to address its real challenges. Think about what this costs in practical terms. When a team learns not to bring bad news until conditions seem safe, problems that could have been addressed early instead grow quietly in the background. By the time they are raised, either because they have grown too large to hide, or because a rare, good day created an opening, they are harder to solve, more expensive to address, and more damaging to the overall project or relationship than they would have been if surfaced weeks earlier. The leader who inspired this filtering does not see this clearly. They experience a world in which problems seem to arrive suddenly and at scale, without the early warning signals they should have had. But those signals were there. They just never reached the leader, because the leader's own behavioral patterns had made honest upward communication too risky. Marcus was also prone to what might be called reactive escalation. When a situation became genuinely difficult, when a project was significantly behind, when a client was unhappy, when a conflict emerged between team members, his first instinct was to act immediately and forcefully. Not necessarily wisely, just forcefully. He experienced inaction in the face of a problem as a kind of failure, and so he moved quickly to assert control, to make a decision, to impose a solution. Sometimes this was helpful. Sometimes it was exactly what was needed. A clear, quick decision that resolved ambiguity and gave the team direction. But sometimes it was not. Sometimes the situation required more information than Marcus had yet gathered. Sometimes it required a conversation with the person involved before a decision could be made. Sometimes it required patience. Sitting with the discomfort of an unresolved problem long enough to understand it properly before moving to fix it. These were the moments where Marcus's need to act, rooted, without his awareness, in emotional discomfort rather than strategic clarity, made things worse rather than better. He would make a rapid decision, driven by the unpleasant feeling of unresolved difficulty, and then find himself 2 weeks later dealing with the downstream consequences of having moved too quickly. The pattern in these situations was consistent enough to be instructive. Marcus would make the hasty call, experience the brief relief of having done something, and then watch as the situation either remained unresolved or deteriorated in a new direction, because the underlying issue had not been properly diagnosed before the solution was applied. His team had learned to privately brace themselves after these moments, knowing that a course correction was likely to follow, which meant that each rapid decision was not only potentially ineffective on its own terms, it also consumed organizational energy and attention in the form of subsequent correction and recalibration. He was not unaware that something wasn't working. He could feel it in a vague, frustrated way. He sensed that his team was not bringing him their full capability, that there was a flatness, a guardedness, a degree of distance in the way people engaged with him that had not always been there. He attributed it, when he thought about it at all, to external factors. The team had some skill gaps. The projects were genuinely complex. The organizational environment was difficult. None of these explanations were false. But none of them were the core of the problem. The core of the problem was that Marcus had never learned to separate his emotional state from his leadership behavior. He had never developed the ability, because no one had ever shown him it was possible or necessary to feel the pressure of a difficult week and choose not to let it manifest in how he treated his team. He had never built the internal discipline to notice, when he was in a reactive emotional state, to pause in that awareness and to choose a response that was calibrated to the situation, rather than to his feelings about the situation. He was not a bad person. He was not even, in the full scope of his character, a bad leader. He had genuine strengths that his team valued, but his reactive patterns were functioning as a ceiling, a cap on how far his natural abilities could actually take him and the people around him. And until he recognized that ceiling for what it was, he was going to keep bumping up against it, without understanding why. This is not an unusual story. It is, in fact, an extremely common one, because most of the people who reach positions of leadership do so on the basis of their technical competence, their drive, their intelligence, and their willingness to take on responsibility. These are real and valuable qualities, but they are not the same as the interior disciplines that leadership at the highest level actually requires. The ability to think strategically rather than react emotionally is not a byproduct of intelligence. The ability to maintain behavioral consistency, regardless of internal emotional state, is not a byproduct of ambition. These are specific, learnable capabilities, but they require deliberate development. They require someone to look honestly at the gap between how they want to be and how they actually are, and to commit to closing it. Marcus's story does not end in failure. It continues, but that continuation is for later. For now, it is enough to see him clearly, to see in him the portrait of a very common kind of leadership limitation, and to begin to understand what would have to change for that limitation to be overcome. Short-term thinking is perhaps the single most common failure mode in leadership. It is so common that in many organizational environments, it has effectively become normalized, so standard, so pervasive, that people who engage in it do not even recognize it as a failure. They see it simply as being responsive, being pragmatic, dealing with reality as it is rather than as they would like it to be. But short-term thinking is not pragmatism. Pragmatism means doing what works. Short-term thinking means doing what provides relief. And relief and what works are often not the same thing. In fact, they are frequently in direct opposition. A leader who avoids a difficult conversation because the immediate discomfort of having it outweighs the immediate benefit is providing themselves with relief. But they are not doing what works, because the unaddressed issue will grow, compound, and eventually demand a far more difficult conversation under far worse conditions. The brief relief was borrowed against a much larger future cost. A leader who approves an initiative because it generates immediate excitement and positive attention, without subjecting it to the rigorous analysis that would reveal its structural weaknesses, is providing the organization with the relief of momentum and optimism. But they are setting the stage for a failure that will be more damaging than the discomfort of honest evaluation would have been. These dynamics are everywhere. They are in the decision to defer the hard conversation, in the choice to pursue the flashy initiative over the unglamorous but foundational work, in the tendency to measure success by how things feel right now rather than by whether the decisions being made today are building towards something genuinely durable. Long-term vision is the antidote, but long-term vision is not simply the ability to describe a future state. It is not just having a compelling narrative about where things are going. It is a particular orientation of attention, a discipline of consistently asking, in any decision, not just, what solves the immediate problem, but, what does this decision make more likely over time? It is the ability to work backward from a desired future and ask what the present moment requires in service of that future, rather than working forward from the present and asking what the present moment is demanding. True leaders think in timescales that extend beyond the pressure of the moment. They maintain a relationship with the future that is stable enough to influence present decisions, even when the present is generating significant emotional noise. This is genuinely difficult. The present is loud. It has urgency, immediacy, and the weight of people's expectations in the here and now. The future is quiet. It has no urgency, or rather, it has urgency that has not yet arrived, which makes it easy to defer. And the mind, without deliberate training, is designed to prioritize the immediate over the eventual. This is why long-term vision must be actively maintained, not passively held. A leader who sits down once a year to articulate their 5-year vision and then never references it again has not developed long-term vision. They have generated a document. Long-term vision lives in the daily practice of returning attention to what matters beyond the immediate, of evaluating current decisions against long-term criteria, and of being willing to accept short-term discomfort in exchange for long-term alignment. Consider what this means for the development of people within an organization. Short-term thinking leads a leader to keep their best people on the tasks those people are already good at, because this produces the most immediate output for the least immediate friction. Long-term thinking leads a leader to stretch those same people into areas where they are not yet strong, to invest in development experiences that may slow immediate output, because the long-term capability that develops from that stretching is worth far more than the short-term efficiency of keeping everyone in their comfort zone. This same tension appears in the area of organizational culture. Building a genuinely strong culture, one of honesty, accountability, and high performance, is slow and difficult work. It requires having uncomfortable conversations about behavior and standards. It requires holding the line on quality when it would be more convenient to accept something less. It requires resisting the temptation to hire quickly for capability and then ignore the cultural fit concerns that were visible in the interview process. All of this is more costly in the short term. All of it pays compounding returns over time. There is a specific form of discipline this requires, and it is the discipline of delayed gratification, applied not just to personal behavior, but to organizational and relational decisions. It is the willingness to make unpopular decisions now that will produce good outcomes later. It is the willingness to invest in foundations that will not produce returns immediately. It is the willingness to accept the discomfort of a slower, more deliberate approach when the pressure to move fast and show results is significant. Long-term thinkers also approach failure differently, because they are always asking what any experience is contributing to the longer arc. They can absorb setbacks without being destroyed by them. Failure is data. It is an event in a longer sequence, not a final verdict. This is not the same as dismissing failure or minimizing its costs. It is situating it accurately within a longer timeline where it has meaning as information rather than simply meaning as pain. The leaders who achieve genuinely lasting influence, the kind of influence that extends beyond their immediate presence, that builds organizations and cultures that outlast their individual tenure, are almost universally characterized by this capacity to think in longer timescales. They are not indifferent to short-term results. They understand accountability. They understand the need to show progress. But they never allow short-term results to become the primary frame for their decisions. They hold the long view with consistency and with something that resembles faith. Not blind faith, but the reasoned confidence that the patient, principled approach will produce better outcomes over time than the reactive, expedient approach, even when the evidence of that is not yet visible. Developing this capacity requires practice, and it requires an honest reckoning with your own tendencies. Most people, if they sit quietly with the question, can identify the areas of their lives and work where they consistently default to short-term relief over long-term alignment. The question is not whether those areas exist. They do for everyone. The question is whether you are willing to look at them directly and begin, consistently and without drama, to make different choices. There is a particular quality of patience that long-term vision requires, and it is worth being precise about what this patience is not. It is not the passive patience of someone who is waiting for circumstances to improve before they take action. That is not patience. It is avoidance with a philosophical overlay. The patience of a long-term thinker is active. It is the patience of someone who is doing the right things consistently, without demanding that the results appear on their preferred timeline. It is the patience of someone who understands that the compounding effect of principled behavior over time is the most powerful force available to any leader. But that it is, by definition, a force that requires time to manifest. This patience is also related to something that might be called perspective. Long-term thinkers have a relationship with their current circumstances that is different from the relationship that short-term reactors have, where a short-term reactor sees the immediate situation as the totality of reality. This problem, right now, is the full weight of everything. A long-term thinker sees it as a frame in a longer film. They have the ability to zoom out, to situate the current difficulty within a larger arc of development, and to ask, given where we are trying to go, what does this moment actually require from us? That question, not, how do I make this discomfort stop? But what does this moment actually require, is one of the most transformative questions a leader can learn to ask, because it redirects attention from the emotional content of the situation to its strategic content, and in doing so, it opens up options that reactive thinking would never perceive. There is a fundamental misunderstanding about communication that holds back a remarkable number of otherwise capable people from genuine leadership. The misunderstanding is this, that communication is primarily about expressing yourself, about getting your thoughts, ideas, and intentions out into the world where others can receive them. By this understanding, the quality of your communication is determined largely by the quality of your ideas and the eloquence with which you articulate them. This understanding is incomplete in a way that matters enormously, because communication, in its deepest and most functional form, is not primarily about expression. It is about connection. It is about creating a state of shared understanding between yourself and another person, or between yourself and a group of people, that enables effective coordination, genuine alignment, and the kind of trust that makes sustained collaboration possible. That shift in emphasis changes everything about how you approach communication. If communication is about expression, your primary job is to say things clearly and compellingly. If communication is about connection, your primary job is to create conditions under which another person feels understood, respected, and genuinely engaged. And that requires far more listening than most people do, and far more attention to the internal experience of the person you are communicating with rather than just to the content you are trying to convey. True leaders are, almost universally, exceptional listeners. Not performative listeners. Not people who maintain eye contact and nod thoughtfully while internally composing their next response. Genuine listeners. People who are actually, functionally curious about what the other person is thinking and feeling and experiencing. People who ask questions not to steer conversations toward predetermined conclusions, but because they genuinely want to understand. People who create the experience, in the person they are talking with, of being fully seen and fully heard. This quality of listening is rarer than it should be. In most professional conversations, both parties are more focused on what they are about to say than on what the other person is currently saying. There is a constant internal monologue running, evaluating, judging, preparing counter-arguments, thinking about how to present one's own position more effectively. This is natural, but it is antithetical to the kind of communication that builds genuine trust and genuine influence. When a person feels truly heard, not just acknowledged, but genuinely understood, something significant happens in the relationship between them and the person listening to them. They become more open, more willing to share complete information rather than edited information, more receptive to the perspective of the person who has demonstrated the willingness and capacity to understand them. The most persuasive thing a leader can do is often not to make a brilliant argument, but to first demonstrate, through genuine attentiveness, that they have heard and understood the other person's position completely. This sequence, listen deeply first, speak clearly second, is one of the most consistently underutilized tools in the entire repertoire of leadership communication. There is also a dimension of leadership communication that has to do with what you do not say, with the questions you ask rather than the statements you make, with the pauses you allow, with the ability to resist the urge to fill every silence with words. Many leaders, particularly those who are naturally articulate and whose success has partly been built on that articulation, have a tendency to over-communicate in the sense of leaving too little space for others to think, to process, and to contribute. The most effective communicators know when to stop speaking. They know that a well-placed question, followed by genuine silence, will generate more authentic engagement and more useful information than a more elaborate statement. This matters in group settings as much as in individual conversations. A leader who dominates the discussion in every meeting is not leading communication. They are monopolizing it. And in monopolizing it, they are training the people in the room to be receivers, rather than contributors, to wait for the direction to come from the front, rather than generate it themselves. Over time, this produces teams that are passive, dependent, and fundamentally less capable than they would be in an environment where their thinking was genuinely invited and genuinely valued. Clarity is another essential dimension of leadership communication. Not just the clarity of well-constructed sentences, but the clarity of being genuinely sure of what you are trying to communicate before you communicate it. A remarkable amount of confusion, misalignment, and organizational friction originates not in malice or incompetence, but in leaders communicating things that they themselves have not yet thought through completely. The words come out, they sound confident, but the underlying thinking has gaps, ambiguities, and unresolved tensions that the listener picks up on, sometimes consciously, sometimes not, and the result is a message that lands with less clarity and less authority than it would have if the communicator had taken the time to genuinely think before speaking. There is a discipline of preparation involved in clear communication that many leaders underestimate. Before a difficult conversation, before a significant presentation, before any communication that carries meaningful weight, knowing precisely what outcome you are hoping to create, knowing what the other person needs from this interaction, and knowing the single most important thing you need them to understand. This kind of pre-communication clarity is not about scripting. It is about thinking deeply enough about the situation that when you speak, your words carry the weight of genuine clarity rather than the approximation of half-formed thought. Leadership communication is also fundamentally about consistency. What you say and what you do must align, and they must align consistently. Not most of the time, not when it is convenient, but reliably, because trust is built on predictability. People need to be able to anticipate, based on past behavior, what a leader will say and do in a given situation. When a leader is consistent, when their actions routinely match their stated values, when their behavior in difficult situations matches the standard they hold in easy situations, people develop a deep, operational trust that translates directly into their willingness to follow, to commit, and to bring their best to the shared enterprise. Inconsistency is trust's greatest enemy. Not dramatic inconsistency, not the obvious hypocrisy that everyone can see, the subtle inconsistency of saying one thing and doing another across dozens of small interactions over time, of holding a different standard on a day when you are tired or stressed, of communicating one priority in a meeting and then making decisions that reflect a different priority in practice. People notice these things. They may not say anything, but they register it, they adjust their trust accordingly, and the cumulative effect is a relationship in which the leader has far less genuine influence than they believe themselves to have. One more dimension of leadership communication deserves attention, because it is perhaps the most counterintuitive, the power of intellectual humility in communication. Many leaders, particularly those who have achieved their position partly through intellectual confidence, resist the explicit acknowledgement of uncertainty or limitation in their thinking. They worry that acknowledging what they do not know will undermine their authority. They hold their conclusions tightly and present them with greater certainty than the underlying analysis warrants. The reality is precisely the opposite. A leader who says, "I may be missing something here. What are you seeing that I'm not?" does not appear weak. They appear wise. They signal to the people around them that they value accuracy over the appearance of knowing everything. They create an environment in which people feel invited to contribute their best thinking, rather than simply to validate the leader's existing conclusions, and they model the intellectual courage that genuine learning requires. The willingness to be wrong, to be surprised, to be changed by evidence. This intellectual humility, expressed through genuine questions and genuine openness to the answers, is one of the most powerful communication tools available to any leader. Not because it generates likability, though it often does, but because it creates the conditions under which a group of people can do their best collective thinking, which is, in any genuinely complex situation, dramatically more powerful than any individual leader's thinking, however brilliant, can ever be alone. One of the most persistent myths about leadership is that genuine leaders are defined by their certainty. That what gives them their authority and their ability to inspire confidence is the projection of knowing exactly what to do. That the mark of a true leader is the confident stride forward, even when, or especially when, the path ahead is not entirely clear. There is something true in this. Confidence, projected with integrity, does inspire confidence in others. Decisiveness, the willingness to make a call and move, is genuinely valuable in leadership and is genuinely rare. But the myth becomes dangerous when it is taken to mean that the appropriate leadership response to uncertainty is to pretend it does not exist, to perform certainty as a management tool, to make decisions before they are ready to be made, simply because the discomfort of acknowledged uncertainty feels incompatible with the leadership role. The reality is almost precisely the opposite. Leaders who pretend to certainty they do not possess are not creating safety for their teams. They are creating false safety, which is far more dangerous. A team operating on the basis of false certainty makes plans that do not account for the genuine range of possible outcomes. It fails to prepare for contingencies. It loses the agility that comes from honest uncertainty, the ability to adjust, to respond, to adapt to a reality that was not anticipated, because everyone was working from a plan premised on a certainty that was never real. Honest acknowledgement of uncertainty, delivered from a position of calm confidence, is one of the most powerful things a leader can do. It communicates to the team that the leader's assessments can be trusted, because they are not being inflated to manage morale, but are instead reflecting genuine analysis. It creates space for the team to contribute their own thinking to the problem of navigating the uncertainty, which almost always produces better solutions than any individual could generate alone. And it builds, over time, a kind of trust that is extremely durable. Because people know that when this leader says they are confident, the confidence is real. The most effective decision makers do not wait for certainty. Certainty, in the genuinely complex environments that leadership navigates, is rarely available. But they also do not pretend to have it. They make decisions in the presence of uncertainty, with a particular kind of clarity that has nothing to do with knowing the outcome in advance. It has to do with knowing their values, knowing their priorities, and being clear about what they are optimizing for, even when the terrain is ambiguous. This is a profound distinction. When you are clear about what you value and what you are working toward, you can make a decision without knowing exactly how it will unfold. The clarity is about direction and about principle, not about outcome. A leader who is genuinely clear about what they are trying to build and why can navigate uncertainty more effectively than any amount of data or analysis can provide. Because clarity purpose generates a decision-making framework that applies even when specific information is unavailable. The psychology of decision-making under pressure is worth examining in some detail. Under pressure, the mind faces a particular kind of challenge. On one side, there is the anxiety of inaction, the discomfort of unresolved questions, the pressure from stakeholders for resolution, the sense of responsibility that makes sitting with ambiguity feel irresponsible. On the other side, there is the risk of action, the possibility that the decision will be wrong, that it will make things worse, that it will reveal the limits of the leader's judgment to people who are watching closely. Most people, when caught between these pressures, do one of two things. They either act prematurely to relieve the discomfort of uncertainty, making a decision before they have enough information, primarily to resolve the emotional tension rather than because the decision is genuinely ready to be made. Or they delay beyond what the situation requires, gathering more and more information in the hope that eventually certainty will arrive and relieve them of the discomfort of having to choose. While things are still unclear, leaders who are genuinely effective at decision-making do neither of these things. They develop a calibrated sense of when enough is known to decide. They understand that perfect information is not available and do not wait for it. But they also understand that some decisions require more time and more information than the emotional pressure of the moment is suggesting, and they have the discipline to hold the discomfort of not yet deciding when that is genuinely what the situation requires. There is also the question of how leaders relate to the decisions they have already made, particularly decisions that do not unfold as intended. A common pattern in reactive leadership is the sunk cost escalation, the tendency to keep investing in a failing course of action because the original decision represented a significant commitment, and abandoning it feels like admitting failure. A leader who is in the grip of this pattern is not actually leading anymore. They are defending a past decision at the expense of present judgment. They are allowing ego and the pain of being wrong to override the clear-eyed assessment that something needs to change, the capacity to reverse a decision, to say clearly and without excessive self-flagellation that new information has changed the situation, that the original decision was made in good faith and with the information available at the time, and that the right thing to do now is change course. This is one of the hallmarks of genuine leadership judgment. It requires a particular kind of ego strength that is, paradoxically, the opposite of what people typically think of as ego. It requires the security to be wrong, the rootedness to acknowledge that your best judgment at a given moment did not produce the desired outcome, and that this does not constitute a fundamental failure of your capability or your character. Leaders who can do this earn enormous trust over time, because people know when they follow a leader who is willing to change course based on evidence, that they will not be led stubbornly down a failed path for the sake of the leader's pride. That the leader's commitment is to the actual outcome, not to the protection of past decisions. This knowledge is deeply freeing. It allows teams to invest fully, without the nagging fear that they are locked into a trajectory that will not be revisited, even when all evidence suggests it should be. There is another dimension of decision-making under uncertainty that deserves careful attention, and that is the question of risk. Every significant decision involves risk. This is simply the nature of operating in a world where outcomes cannot be perfectly predicted. But there are two fundamentally different relationships a person can have with risk, and they lead to very different leadership outcomes. The first relationship is one of avoidance. A leader who is primarily motivated by the avoidance of risk will consistently choose the option that minimizes the potential for a bad outcome, even when that option also minimizes the potential for a good one. They will defer decisions longer than necessary, qualify their commitments more than the situation requires, and consistently steer toward the center of the road, even when the situation calls for a clear directional move. This is sometimes described by the people who engage in it as prudence or responsibility, but it is often, in fact, a form of fear dressed in the language of caution, and organizations led by fear of failure, even fear that presents itself as careful stewardship, tend to lose the creative energy, the experimental spirit, and the willingness to try genuinely new things that sustainable excellence requires. The second relationship with risk is one of calibration. A calibrated leader does not ignore risk or dismiss it. They assess it carefully, honestly, and with as much information as they can reasonably gather, and then they make a decision about whether the potential upside, the value that could be created, the progress that could be made, the problem that could be solved, justifies taking on the associated risk. This is not recklessness. Recklessness is acting without properly assessing risk. Calibration is assessing it properly and then choosing to proceed anyway when the assessment warrants it. The difference is in the quality and honesty of the analysis, not in the boldness of the outcome. What makes this calibration possible, in practical terms, is a clear framework of what you are trying to achieve. A leader who is genuinely clear about their goals, about what success looks like and what failure would actually cost, can assess risk against that framework rather than against a vague background anxiety about negative outcomes in general. They can ask in the context of what we are trying to build, is this risk one we can afford to take? Is the downside survivable? Does the potential upside meaningfully advance us toward our goal? These are answerable questions with a specific goal in view. Without a clear goal, they are not. This is one of the most underappreciated reasons why long-term vision matters to decision-making. It is not only that long-term vision keeps you oriented toward what matters over time. It is that it gives you the evaluative framework you need to make good decisions about risk in the moment. Without a clear and stable sense of what you are building toward, every risk feels like a threat, because there is no larger purpose against which to weigh it. With a clear and stable sense of direction, risks can be evaluated for what they are: steps along a path, some of which are worth taking and some of which are not. There is also the question of how to communicate decisions under uncertainty to the people who are affected by them. This is a genuine art. The leader who acknowledges that a decision is being made in the face of incomplete information, but who communicates with clarity about what they do know, what they are trying to achieve, and what their reasoning is. This leader generates trust rather than anxiety, even in the presence of uncertainty, because people can tolerate uncertainty far more readily when they trust that the person navigating on their behalf is thinking clearly, communicating honestly, and genuinely committed to the shared goal. What people cannot tolerate, what generates the kind of chronic organizational anxiety that corrodes performance, is uncertainty combined with a lack of confidence in the quality of the leadership thinking being applied to it. So the leader's task in communicating decisions under uncertainty is to separate the two things. To be honest about the uncertainty of the outcome, while being utterly clear and confident about the quality of the thinking and the integrity of the process that led to the decision. These are separable. The outcome is not known. The process was rigorous and principled. Both things can be true simultaneously, and communicating both of them with clarity gives people something solid to hold on to even when the path ahead is not fully visible. Discipline is not glamorous. It rarely finds its way into the inspiring quotes that get shared on professional networks or stitched on motivational materials. It does not have the immediate emotional resonance of passion or vision or charisma. But it is, of all the qualities that genuine leadership requires, perhaps the most foundational, because all of the other qualities, the emotional regulation, the long-term vision, the clear communication, the effective decision-making, are built and sustained through discipline. Without it, they exist only as potential. With it, they become reality. Discipline, in the context of leadership, is not about self-punishment or rigidity or the joyless adherence to rules. It is about the conscious, deliberate alignment of your daily behavior with your deepest values and highest intentions. It is the practice of doing what you have decided to do when you said you would do it at the standard you set for it. Not only when it is convenient or enjoyable, or when others are watching, but consistently, because consistency is the only thing that actually builds capability, character, and trust over time. Consider what inconsistent standards communicate to the people around a leader. When a standard is applied rigorously on good days and loosely on difficult ones, what is actually being communicated is not the standard itself, but the conditions under which the standard applies. And those conditions, ease, comfort, good mood, are precisely the conditions under which standards matter least. Standards exist for the difficult conditions. They exist for the moment when it would be easier and more comfortable to let things slide, to make an exception, to tell yourself that this particular situation is different. The discipline of maintaining standards in those moments is the real measure of whether the standards are real. Personal standards are the internal expression of this discipline. They are the behaviors you hold yourself to regardless of how others are behaving, regardless of whether anyone would know if you slipped, regardless of whether the pressure of a particular moment is making the easier path more attractive. Your personal standards are the architecture of your character. They shape, over time, who you actually are, not who you intend to be, not who you present yourself as, but who you demonstrably, behaviorally, consistently are. This matters for leadership because leaders, by definition, operate under scrutiny. People are watching, even when the leader does not think they are. They are watching how you handle small things as much as large ones. How you treat people who have nothing to offer you. How you behave when you are under pressure. Whether you are the same person in private that you are in public, or close enough to the same that the gap is honest and acknowledged rather than concealed. There is a particular test of discipline that is worth naming directly because it is one that most leaders face regularly and many handle poorly. It is the test of the moment when your own standard would cost you something you want. When doing the right thing means losing an opportunity, accepting a difficulty, or delaying a reward. When the path of integrity runs directly through something uncomfortable, and the path of expedience is right there, and no one would necessarily know the difference. This is the real test of discipline. Not the disciplined behavior you exhibit when it is easy and when it aligns with your interests. That is not discipline at all. It is just convenience. Discipline is what happens in the moments where doing the right thing requires something from you. Where you would prefer not to hold the standard, but you hold it anyway, because you have decided who you are, and you are committed to being that person regardless of the cost. Over time, the accumulation of these decisions, these private, unglamorous, costly choices toward integrity, is what builds a character that other people can genuinely trust. And character, not charisma or competence alone, is the foundation of lasting leadership influence. Discipline also produces a particular kind of mental clarity. When you are living in alignment with your values, when what you do matches what you believe, there is a sense of internal coherence that is both peaceful and energizing. You do not carry the cognitive and emotional weight of incongruence. You are not managing the subtle anxiety of knowing that you say one thing and do another. Your energy is available for the work rather than consumed by the maintenance of a gap between your stated values and your actual behavior. Building genuine discipline is a practice, not a decision. The decision to be more disciplined is, in itself, worth nothing. What matters is the daily practice of making the small, often unglamorous choices that constitute disciplined behavior over time. Choosing to have the difficult conversation instead of avoiding it. Choosing to prepare thoroughly instead of relying on agility and intelligence to compensate. Choosing to maintain the standard when no one would notice if you didn't. These are the choices, made consistently over time, that build the kind of character from which genuine leadership naturally flows. There is a deeper psychology here that is worth exploring. Most people think of discipline as something they apply to themselves from the outside, as a kind of force they exert against their own preferences and inclinations in order to behave as they think they should. By this understanding, discipline is effortful by definition. It requires ongoing willpower expenditure, ongoing resistance to the pull of comfort or convenience, and because willpower is finite and depletable, discipline understood this way will always eventually give way. But there is another way of understanding and cultivating discipline, and it is rooted in identity rather than in effort. When the disciplined behavior is understood not as what you have to do, but as an expression of who you are. When I am someone who keeps commitments is a genuine self-concept rather than an aspiration. The relationship to the behavior changes fundamentally. You are no longer fighting yourself to be disciplined. You are simply being yourself, and being yourself requires far less ongoing effort than overcoming yourself. This is why the deepest form of discipline is not cultivated through rules and systems, though those can be useful scaffolding. It is cultivated through the patient, repeated practice of asking yourself, before and after every significant action, whether this is consistent with the kind of person you are committed to being. It is cultivated through the gradual, intentional construction of a self-concept that includes the leader you want to be, not just the person you currently are. And it is cultivated through the willingness to be honest, when the gap between the two is larger than you would like it to be, and to close that gap through behavior rather than through the comfort of good intentions. Leadership identity, the genuine internal sense of yourself as a person who leads from principle, who maintains standards, who owns their outcomes and shows up with consistency, is not conferred by any external process. It is built, piece by piece, through precisely the kind of small disciplined choices we have been describing. Every time you choose the difficult path because it is the right one, you are making a deposit into the account of your leadership identity. Every time you take the easy path when the difficult one was clearly right, you are making a withdrawal. And over time, the balance of those deposits and withdrawals becomes who you are, as clearly and as functionally as any formal credential or official title. There is a quality that distinguishes leaders who are genuinely followed from leaders who are merely obeyed, and that quality is trust. Not just the intellectual recognition that a leader is competent or well-positioned or strategically aligned with the organization's interests. Deep, operational, psychological trust. The kind that makes people willing to go into difficult territory with someone, to extend the benefit of the doubt in ambiguous situations, to bring their honest assessment of a problem rather than the version they think will be most well received. This kind of trust cannot be commanded. It cannot be demanded or manufactured through communication strategy or leadership development programs. It is built, slowly and cumulatively, through a particular quality of consistent behavior over time. And the foundation of that behavior is integrity. The alignment between what a person says and what they do, maintained consistently across situations and conditions. Integrity is, in practice, a simpler concept than it is often made to seem. It means doing what you say you will do. It means keeping commitments, even small ones. It means being honest in your assessments, even when honesty is uncomfortable. It means acknowledging when you were wrong, without the kind of elaborate qualification that makes the acknowledgement meaningless. It means being the same person in your one-on-one conversations as you are in the group setting, not presenting a different face to different audiences based on what will generate the most approval in each context. Most people have good intentions regarding integrity. Most people do not deliberately lie or manipulate or break commitments without reason. But there is a more subtle form of integrity failure that is nearly universal, and it is the failure of small commitments. The statement of intention that is not followed through, the stated priority that consistently receives less time and attention than its stated priority status should warrant. The acknowledgement that something needs to be addressed, followed by the prolonged absence of addressing it. These are small things, but small things accumulate, and what they accumulate into, in the minds of the people watching, is a data set about reliability, about whether this person's words can be taken at face value. The concept of psychological safety is closely related to trust and is worth exploring carefully. Psychological safety is the belief, held by a member of a group, that it is safe to speak up, to raise concerns, to challenge ideas, to acknowledge mistakes, to bring bad news, to disagree. Research in organizational psychology has consistently shown that psychological safety is the most important predictor of team performance, more important than individual talent, more important than resources, more important than the specific strategy being pursued. And the primary determinant of psychological safety is the behavior of the leader. A leader who responds to difficult feedback defensively, even mildly defensively, teaches their team that difficult feedback is risky. A leader who punishes mistakes more consistently than they celebrate honest effort teaches their team to hide mistakes and inflate their presentation of outcomes. A leader who talks over people, dismisses concerns, or makes quick judgments about ideas before they are fully articulated teaches their team to bring only safe, pre-approved ideas rather than the raw, creative, sometimes incomplete thinking from which genuine innovation and genuine problem-solving emerge. This is why the relationship between trust and performance is not metaphorical or abstract. It is direct and measurable. A team that trusts its leader brings its full intelligence to the work. A team that does not is perpetually managing around the relationship, which is a significant and continuous drain on the energy and capability that should be going toward the actual task. Trust is also built through something that might be called relational consistency, the experience, accumulated over time, that a leader treats people with a reliable quality of respect and care regardless of the circumstances. A leader who is generous and warm when things are going well, but critical and withdrawn when they are not, is not building trust. They are building a conditional relationship in which people never quite feel secure enough to bring their full selves. The leaders who are most deeply respected and most genuinely followed are often not the most brilliant strategists or the most charismatic communicators. They are the people who have demonstrated, through years of consistent behavior, that their word means something, that they see and value the people around them, and that they can be counted on to act with integrity. Even when other options would be more convenient, this quality, call it character, call it reliability, call it the integration of values and behavior, is the deepest form of leadership influence because it is independent of any external authority or positional power. It is worth spending a moment on what it feels like, from the inside, to be in a relationship of genuine trust with a leader, because most people have not experienced it, which is a remarkable thing to say, but true. Most people have worked for leaders they respected in certain dimensions. For their competence, their results, their strategic thinking, but genuine trust, of the kind being described here, is different. It is characterized by a particular kind of ease, not the ease of low standards or low accountability. Those create a different kind of ease, one that has contempt underneath it. But the ease of knowing that you are in an environment where honesty is genuinely valued, where mistakes are addressed rather than punished, where your contribution matters to someone who is paying real attention. In that kind of environment, people give more. Not because they have been motivated to do so through incentive structures or performance management systems, though those may exist, but because the quality of the relationship itself generates a form of commitment that is different in kind from the compliance that authority can command. People who trust their leader will go beyond what is strictly required. They will raise their concerns early, before problems compound. They will take on difficult assignments without excessive self-protection. They will bring their best thinking, even when that thinking is incomplete or uncertain, because they trust that it will be received in good faith. This is, ultimately, the most compelling argument for the primacy of character in leadership, not that it is the morally right way to be, though it is, but that it is functionally superior. The returns from genuine trust, over time, dwarf the returns from any other leadership strategy or technique. Because trust compounds, an organization where genuine trust is present consistently outperforms one where it is not, because trust is the lubricant that reduces friction in every human interaction. It makes communication faster, decision-making cleaner, conflict resolution less costly, and creative risk-taking safer. Every single thing that organizations need to do well is done better in a high trust environment. And high trust environments are built, without exception, by leaders who have decided to be trustworthy, not as a strategy, but as a way of being. Now let us return to Marcus, but not to the version of Marcus who was managing by his moods and creating guardedness in his team. Let us go forward in time to a version of Marcus who had been honest enough with himself to see the pattern. It happened at a particular moment, in a particular conversation. A peer who had known Marcus for years and who trusted him enough to say difficult things sat across from him after a particularly challenging quarter and said, quietly and directly, "Marcus, I think your team is afraid of you. Not afraid of you as a person, but afraid of your reaction. I think they're managing you, and I think it's costing you." Marcus's first instinct, in that moment, was defensive. He felt the rise of a counter-argument, a list of reasons why this characterization was unfair. An inventory of all the ways he was actually a supportive and approachable leader. He felt the familiar pull toward self-protection, toward the story that the problem was elsewhere. But something made him pause. Maybe it was the genuine care in his colleague's voice. Maybe it was the quiet knowledge, somewhere under the defensiveness, that this was not entirely new information, that he had sensed this dynamic without fully naming it. He paused, he breathed, and he asked, genuinely, "Tell me what you mean. Tell me what you've seen." The conversation that followed was one of the more uncomfortable hours of Marcus's professional life. His colleague was honest in a way that most people in professional relationships never manage to be. She described specific behaviors, specific patterns, specific moments where Marcus's emotional state had visibly altered the dynamic of a meeting or a one-on-one. She did it without cruelty, without exaggeration, without agenda other than the genuine desire for Marcus to have the information he needed to do better. Marcus listened. He did not agree with everything, and he said so, calmly. But he took significantly more in than he pushed back on, and when he walked back to his office, the feeling he sat with was not the temporary relief of defended ego. It was the more unsettling and more useful feeling of genuine reckoning. What followed was not a dramatic transformation. Real change rarely is dramatic. It was quiet, incremental, and built from small, consistent choices made differently than before. Marcus started paying attention, actively, deliberately, to the physical sensations of emotional reactivity as they arose in meetings and conversations. He learned to recognize the particular tightness in his chest, the quickening of his breath, that preceded the sharpness in his communication. He began, when he felt those signals, to do something very simple, to pause for a moment before speaking. Not a theatrical pause, just a breath, just enough space to ask himself, is what I am about to say from the best part of me? Is it calibrated to the situation or to my emotional state? This sounds small. It is not small. Creating that space between stimulus and response, between emotion and action, is one of the most significant internal developments a human being can make. It does not happen all at once. It is built gradually through practice, through the accumulation of individual moments where you choose the regulated response over the reactive one. Marcus also began to pay different kinds of attention to his team. He started noticing when people seemed to be choosing their words carefully around him, and instead of passing over those moments, he began to gently open them up. He became someone who created invitations for honesty rather than inadvertently closing them off. And the team, slowly, and with the caution that comes from having been conditioned otherwise, began to respond to those invitations. Over time, genuine time, not weeks but years of consistent practice. Something shifted in the environment he led. The quality of the information he received from his team changed. The conversations became more direct. The problems came to him earlier. The meetings had a different texture, less managed, more real. He became, for the people around him, a stabilizing presence. Not because he had suppressed his feelings and become stoic, but because he had developed a genuine rootedness, a settledness, that allowed others to feel safer, steadier, more willing to bring their full thinking to the shared work. He was still recognizably Marcus. The intelligence, the drive, the genuine care for the work were all still there. But the quality of his presence had changed. There was a settledness to him now, a groundedness that had not been there before. And the people around him felt it. Not because he had performed steadiness, but because he had actually built it through years of private, unglamorous interior work. This is what leadership development actually looks like. The quiet, daily practice of choosing, in the face of difficulty, discomfort, and uncertainty, to be the person you want to be, rather than simply the person your emotions are pushing you toward being. Consistently. Because that is how character is built, and character is what leadership, in its deepest form, actually is. We have traveled far in this conversation. We have moved through the foundations of leadership, through ownership, through emotional regulation, through the disciplines of long-term thinking and clear communication and principled decision-making. We have looked honestly at the patterns that hold intelligent, capable people back from their full leadership potential. We have followed a human story of limitation and growth, not a perfect story, not a dramatic one, but a true one in the way that it reflects the actual texture of genuine development. And now, at the end, it is worth sitting with the simplest and most important truth that all of this has been circling around. Leadership is not about control. This is perhaps the most common misunderstanding in all of leadership thinking. The belief that the job of a leader is to maintain control of outcomes, of people, of environments, of the narrative about how things are going. Leaders who operate from this understanding spend enormous energy in the project of control, and they exhaust themselves and the people around them in its pursuit. Because control, in the real, complex, human world of organizations and relationships and uncertainty, is largely illusory. You cannot control outcomes. You cannot control how people will respond to you. You cannot control the external conditions that will arrive without warning and demand something of you that you did not anticipate. What you can control, fully, completely, with genuine authority, is yourself. How you think, how you respond, the standards you hold yourself to, the quality of your attention in any given moment, the degree of honesty you bring to your own self-assessment, the consistency with which your behavior aligns with your values. This is where your actual power lies, not in the control of others or the management of circumstances, but in the governance of yourself. Leadership is about responsibility, not responsibility as burden, though it is often heavy, responsibility as orientation, as the fundamental choice to locate accountability for your life and your outcomes primarily within yourself, rather than outside yourself, to say, in the face of any circumstance, that your response is yours. That how you navigate this, whatever this is, reflects choices you are making, not conditions that are happening to you. Leadership is about remaining calm when others panic. This is not emotional coldness. It is something warmer and more demanding than that. It is the willingness to hold steadiness for others. To be, in the moment when anxiety spreads and judgment contracts, the grounding presence that reminds everyone that clarity is available, that the situation can be navigated, that there is a next step even when the step after that is not yet visible. This steadiness is a form of service. It is, in many ways, the highest form of service a leader can offer. Not the brilliant strategy, not the inspiring vision, though both have their place, but the reliable, available, consistent quality of regulated presence. Leadership is about remaining clear when others react. When the emotional temperature rises and reactive thinking takes hold, when people begin to defend rather than think, to blame rather than solve, to protect rather than progress, the leader's job is to maintain access to clarity, to hold the frame of what we are actually trying to accomplish, to ask the questions that cut through the noise of reaction and return attention to what matters. This clarity is cultivated through the interior disciplines we have discussed throughout this work. Through the long-term orientation, the emotional regulation, the grounded sense of values that does not shift with every change in circumstance. Leadership is about remaining focused when others lose direction. In the entropy of complex, pressured environments, direction gets lost constantly. Not through malice, not through incompetence, but through the sheer volume of competing demands, shifting priorities, and immediate urgencies that constantly pull attention away from what matters most. The leader's job is to maintain and continuously re-establish the line between where things are and where they are intended to go, to keep returning with patience and without drama to the question of what we are here to do, and whether what we are doing right now is genuinely serving that purpose. None of this requires a title. None of it requires formal authority, organizational seniority, or the approval of any institution. Every human being who is willing to develop the interior architecture of genuine leadership, to build the self-awareness, the emotional discipline, the clarity of values, the long-term orientation, is available to exercise genuine leadership in whatever sphere they inhabit, in a family, in a community, in a small team or a large organization, in the quiet influence of a person who shows up consistently, who keeps their word, who tells the truth, even when it is uncomfortable, who remains steady when others are destabilized. The work of becoming that person begins not at some future point when conditions are right or when you have acquired some necessary credential or experience. It begins now, not with a dramatic declaration or a sweeping change of behavior, with something much quieter, with the decision to pay attention, to notice honestly and without self-judgment the patterns in your thinking and responding that do not yet reflect the leader you want to be, and to begin in small and daily ways, to close the gap between who you are and who you are capable of becoming. There will be days when the gap feels large, when the old reactive patterns reassert themselves with full force, and you say or do something that you immediately recognize as falling short of the standard you are working toward. These days are not failures of your fundamental capacity. They are data. They are part of the process. The leader you are becoming will not emerge without friction. They will emerge through it. Through the honest recognition of your patterns, the patient return to your values, the willingness to begin again after a difficult moment without excessive self-criticism, or self-indulgence. There will also be days, and they will come if you stay with the work, when you notice something has shifted, when you navigate a situation that would previously have triggered a reactive response and find yourself doing something different. Not perfectly, not without effort, but differently. When you choose the honest conversation rather than the avoidance. When you stay present in a difficult meeting rather than withdrawing emotionally. When you make a decision from a place of clarity rather than from a place of pressure. These moments are small, but they accumulate. And what they accumulate into is a person who is, genuinely and demonstrably, becoming someone different, someone more capable, more consistent, more worthy of the trust and influence that genuine leadership requires. The people who surround you will notice this before you do. They will notice it in the texture of the conversations you have with them, in the quality of your attention, in the reliability of your behavior across different kinds of situations, and their response to it. The gradual loosening of caution, the willingness to bring more complete and more honest information, the quality of engagement that becomes possible when people feel genuinely safe, will confirm something important, that the interior work you are doing is not abstract or self-indulgent. It is directly, tangibly serving the people who depend on your leadership. That gap and the discipline of closing it, that is where leadership lives. That is where it has always lived. Not in the title, not in the authority, not in the performance of strength, in the steady, honest, disciplined work of becoming someone worthy of the influence you seek. Begin there, and begin now,